Low-frequency reflections in smaller spaces may be the reason for the biggest acoustic problem that small studios face: standing waves, aka room modes. And it can be a big mistake to ignore these, and not at least try to address them. Standing waves are the result of phase interference from low-frequency reflections. Now, remember, when mid- and high-frequency waves reflect off room surfaces, they also cause phase interference, comb filtering, but their wavelengths are short, typically less than a foot and as little as inches, so the resulting frequency irregularities are dispersed throughout the room, and as long as the reflections are managed appropriately, they simply manifest themselves as part of the room's ambience. But low-frequency wavelengths are long, often as long as or even longer than room dimensions, especially in the smaller-sized rooms common to most small studio setups. When the wavelengths of certain frequencies are multiples of the various room dimensions, height, width, and depth, then the phase interference that occurs from their reflections is not dispersed throughout the room, but localized to specific locations in the room. This results in problem zones in the room. The phase interference creates pockets of either cancellation or reinforcement at those frequencies at specific, predictable spots in the room between both pairs of walls and between floor and ceiling. These are standing waves, or room modes. They'll occur at various frequencies with long enough wavelengths, typically below 200 or 300 Hz. The areas of cancellation are called nodes, and sound at those particular frequencies is missing when the listener is standing in one of those spots. The areas of reinforcement are called antinodes, and sound at those particular frequencies is emphasized when the listener is standing in one of those spots. So, depending on where the listener happens to be, the bass response in the room may be drastically different. Up against the walls and the center of the room are particular problem zones in any rectangular space. Needless to say, this can make it almost impossible to make valid low-frequency EQ decisions when mixing. How can you determine the correct amount of bass EQ to dial up if you're not even sure that whatever bass you're hearing is actually in the recording and not just a playback artifact of that one spot in that one room you're in? This may be the cause of the most common flaw in many mixes coming out of smaller, untreated rooms. When the mix is heard in other, often more well-balanced playback environments, the bass is frequently either way too strong, making the mix sound muddy overall, or way too weak, making it sound overly thin. The EQ decisions made by the mixer were based on what he heard in his mix room, but what he heard may have been the result of he, and possibly the monitors, being located in one or more of these node or antinode spots. His EQ choices may have made the mix sound better in that one spot, but heard over a system that doesn't share those exact low-end irregularities, the EQ applied just ends up making the mix sound worse rather than better. Unfortunately, this problem cannot be addressed with the shallow foam absorbers that work to tame mid- and high-frequency reflection issues. The longer wavelengths would require much greater depth for absorption. The most effective approach to dealing with room modes is to design cavities into the walls. These are generally referred to as bass traps. A quick search will turn up terms like Helmholtz resonator and diaphragmatic absorber. The proper location and depth of such a cavity would have to be calculated based on the specific size and dimensions of the space. This is not as daunting as it may sound. There are plenty of books and materials that go into the nitty-gritty for anyone who feels they're handy enough with standard construction techniques and wants to take on a project. However, in an existing space, there may not be enough depth behind the walls to allow for this. As an alternative, several companies make and sell surface-mounted products that provide a reasonable degree of treatment for standing wave issues. To get the needed results in a particular room, you'd submit that room's dimensions and any other pertinent information, measurements of the standing wave frequencies, etc., to the company, and they'll recommend the product with the best size and shape to deal with that particular installation. If you were fortunate enough to be addressing these issues while actually building a space from scratch, you could minimize the effects of standing waves at the get-go by matching the room's dimensions to one of a number of so-called golden mean room ratios. These are recommended length by width by height dimensions that have been calculated to spread out the inevitable room modes so they not only don't overlap, doubling or tripling the severity of the issue, but are spaced out as evenly as possible to significantly minimize any differences in low-end balance throughout the room. When none of these physical solutions is possible, some people turn to EQ to deal with low-end and other frequency irregularities in the studio. But that approach may not always be an ideal solution. I'll address it in the next video. At the very least, even if it really isn't possible to effectively eliminate standing waves, you can at least try to avoid them as best as possible by carefully positioning the monitors and the listener's sweet spot at locations in the room that don't correspond to any node or antinode spots. Obviously, you'll have to calculate the locations of these zones in the room, or at least the primary axial modes. Yes, there are even different types, though the axial modes are the strongest. I won't get into the math here, but it's relatively simple. Again, a quick search should turn up the way to calculate and map out the worst of the room modes in a space of particular dimensions, and then you can rearrange the studio furniture to find the most even locations in the room, frequency-wise, for speakers and listener. It's obviously not the best solution, but it's still way better than ignoring the issue altogether and blindly relying on dumb luck to determine if your mixes end up traveling well to other listeners in other places.